second inaugural address of President George W. Bush, quote, "The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands," close quote. To be safe at home, we need to promote liberty abroad. Do you buy that?
Yes, to a certain extent. I think it depends on how you want to promote liberty. And, we have some people who think supporting the Syrian rebels right now is a way to promote liberty. I think it's much more murky than that. We need to have a healthier debate to determine when we get involved and when we don't get involved. You could argue that the Arab Spring has brought more liberty to the Middle East, but you could also argue that democracy, they have chosen people who are much more antagonistic towards our country, and that if anything, the governments that ultimately settle in Egypt, in Libya, and maybe in Syria, depending on what happens, may or may not be more friendly towards America, and there's a very good chance we'll be less friendly. So you have to be careful what you wish for.
Okay, I'm going to try to continue to draw you out here. You gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation on foreign policy this past February. Quote, "Ronald Reagan did not shy from labeling the Soviet Union an evil empire, but he also sat down with Gorbachev and negotiated reductions in nuclear weapons." True. Of course, Reagan sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev after the biggest military buildup in our history, a 600-ship Navy, arming freedom fighters in Central America and Afghanistan, and initiating the Strategic Defense Initiative. So Reagan uses rhetoric and he uses diplomacy, but boy, did he also use power, right?
Yes, but I would say if you look at him with regard to involvement, I would say that he, in some ways, was more restrained than presidents before or after him as far as direct military involvement. When we were in Lebanon and had the tragedy with the Marines there, he actually made the decision to come home because he said it was too murky and they couldn't figure out and there wasn't a safe way to have them in there. It gets, goes forward to like Benghazi now. Was it safe to have an embassy there? Was it safe to have an embassy under State Department control? Was it safe to stay there when all your military support was saying we need more security and it was denied? So I think that Reagan really exemplified peace through strength. But I think some of the neoconservatives up here interpret that as war through strength, that war is always the option, that we always have to be involved. But consequently, they get caught up in a lot of contradictions. So, for example, many of the people who wanted to arm the Libyan rebels also wanted to arm Gaddafi the year before. Now many of them want to arm the Syrian rebels who are allied with al-Qaeda against Assad, who is also allied with the Christians. So it's really a murky situation you have in Syria, and I'm not sure it's a good idea.
So your heroes as chief executives would be Ronald Reagan, who uses a great deal of force, but rhetoric and diplomacy, and is very careful about actually using force, or maybe Dwight Eisenhower, who ends the war in Korea 6 weeks into his presidency, and then throughout the rest of his presidency, there's only one direct engagement in Lebanon.
I think Eisenhower's been underappreciated.
Yeah,
and one of his quotes that I love is that he says, "I hate war like only a soldier who's lived it can."
Right.
The stupidity, the banality, the futility.
So, Iraq, was it a mistake to go in the first place?
Yes.
It was in the first place. Okay.
Not with Afghanistan. I was supportive of going into Afghanistan, but even Afghanistan now, the mission's been lost, and we've gotten bin Laden, we've disrupted the Taliban, and after 10 years, if we haven't trained the Afghan army, we're not going to. But I would say there's a good analogy in Afghanistan as to why Syria is such a mistake. After 10 years of being in Afghanistan, it's a fairly stable, it's like we can pick people to be in the military on the Afghan side and we train them. We still can't figure out friend from foe. Many people join the Afghan army and they just lie. They say, oh yes, we were supportive of Americans. And when the American soldier turns, they shoot him in the back. That's happened 100 times. Imagine how much more difficult it's going to be in Syria when you're handing out Stinger missiles and manpads and all of this sophisticated weapons to decide who's friend and who's foe.
Okay, so let me ask about Pakistan, say. We've got the drone program going on. They're killing bad guys. There's collateral damage, horrible phrase for meaning deaths to civilians.
Right.
That requires, as I understand it, that requires a presence on the ground to develop our own intelligence separate from what the Pakistanis tell us. And the notion would be that that's pretty directly related to the defense of this republic. We're not trying to engage in nation building in Pakistan. So you'd support the drone program?
I think that within and throughout the world, on-the-ground intelligence is something that we do have to spend money on and that we do need to be concerned with. And that means Arabic speakers in our military as well as our State Department and people living in those countries and knowing about it. Pakistan is probably one of the most worrisome places in the world. There's a significant amount of hatred for America there. But I don't see giving $2 billion a year directly to the Pakistan government. They're imprisoning really the best informant we ever had, maybe, or one of the betters, Shakil Afridi, who helped us get information on bin Laden. We're not going to get much more information from informants if we don't protect our informants. And I think it's been a mistake that we continue to give money to Pakistan despite them imprisoning him for the rest of his life. With regard to the drone program, there's definitely a usefulness for drones within combat and within the military. Anything that can save our soldiers' lives, I'm for. Killing non-combatants, American citizens, I think they should be tried for treason. It's a very rare occurrence. We've only targeted one, and I think he should have just been tried for treason. Then maybe you target him, but really there should have been a court. I don't like a politician deciding guilt of an American. Next time you're in France, I don't like them just deciding to, waylay you with a drone as opposed to having some kind of court decide that you're a traitor. With regard to foreigners, I think there is a time, bin Laden, I think, deserved what he got, and he should have, whether it was with a drone or with individual soldiers. And so there are some leaders of these terrorists that I think should be killed. But once you've knocked off the top leadership, and then you knock off the next leadership and the next leadership, is there ever an end? And is there a point in time at which it becomes sort of a recruiting tool and a negative thing for America? And I think there is a point in time. There's also a point in time when you antagonize the host country to a degree that they're no longer interested in. And I think that's where we are with Pakistan. The war's gone on too long. People are ready for that war to be over, and so am I. It doesn't mean that we withdraw from the world, but it does mean that the time has come for the war to end in Afghanistan.
Two last questions on foreign policy. Once again, let me quote President George W. Bush. He's speaking in May 2008. Israel's population may be just over 7 million, but when you confront terror and evil, Israel's population is 307 million because America stands with you, close quote. Is that an overconstruction? Should he make it clear that we're two sovereign nations and our interests don't always coincide, that except in very rare circumstances, we expect Israel to look to its own defense itself?
Well, I think it is accepted in border skirmishes and this and that Israel will act in their own self-defense, and that doesn't always involve the U.S. But I think it also is a useful thing to be known that we are an ally of Israel and that an attack on Israel will be something that we will respond to.
And the last question, in your March budget, you brought down military spending, but not a lot, actually. You called for a military budget, as I recall, of about $580 billion. In other words,
we actually got rid of the sequester in our budget and allowed the military budget to grow above what the sequester level were by cutting significantly other programs.
So it would be a misunderstanding of Rand Paul to say, oh, he just wants to bring everybody home. You actually call for a Pentagon, a defense establishment that remains more powerful and better funded than the next X number of countries put together, correct?
Right. There's 14 countries combined. The next 14 countries combined equal our budget. Now, I'm not saying there's not room for savings within our budget. I am for auditing the Pentagon. I am for cutting costs in the Pentagon. But what I would say is that if you're willing to cut in other parts of the budget significantly, that defense is one of our priorities. Defense is what the federal government should be doing. It is constitutional. And I'm willing to do that and willing to make it a priority. But I'm not willing to say, oh, let's throw out the sequester just to feed the military-industrial complex. I'm saying you have to keep the sequester if you're not willing to cut significantly in other places.